You think you understand virtue. Be honest, be brave, be kind. Simple stuff. Sunday school morality. But there was a man in Athens who spent his entire life proving you wrong. A physician's son who dissected ethics the way his father dissected bodies. Aristotle didn't just write about virtue. He built a system so precise, so psychologically sophisticated, that 2,400 years later, neuroscientists are still finding his insights hardwired into the human brain. His model wasn't about rules. It wasn't about consequences. It was about becoming, and the genius of it. He figured out that being good is a skill. Not a feeling, not a commandment. A skill. One you practice the way a musician practices scales. One you can actually fail at. And here's what nobody tells you. His system predicted weakness of will before modern psychology had a name for it. He mapped friendship into 3 distinct categories that explain every relationship you've ever had. He understood that happiness isn't something you chase, it's something you do, right now, every single day, for the rest of your life. So how did a Greek philosopher born in 384 BCE crack the code on human flourishing that we're still decoding today? If you value documented philosophy and evidence-based history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. This script is researched and factual, drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's peer-reviewed entry on Aristotelian ethics, updated continuously by scholars, and from the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham, which published groundbreaking research on phronesis in the Journal of Positive Psychology in 2022. These aren't surface-level sources. These are the academic institutions rebuilding Aristotle's framework with modern empirical methods. Now back to the information. 384 BCE, Stagira, a coastal town in northern Greece, about 55 kilometers east of modern Thessaloniki. This is where Aristotle enters the world. His father, Nicomachus, serves as personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon. Medicine runs in the bloodline. The family claims descent from Asclepius himself, the legendary god of healing. Young Aristotle grows up watching his father work. Dissection, diagnosis, the careful observation of symptoms, the logical progression from cause to effect. This matters. This shapes everything that comes after, because Aristotle will eventually treat ethics the same way. Not as abstract philosophy floating in some metaphysical realm, but as a practical science grounded in observable human behavior. Both parents die while Aristotle is still young. His guardian, Proxenus of Atarneus, takes over his education. At 17 or 18, the young man travels to Athens. He enrolls in Plato's academy. This is the intellectual center of the Greek world. Plato is teaching his theory of forms, the idea that perfect, unchanging archetypes exist in a higher realm, that the physical world is just imperfect copies. Aristotle stays for 20 years. He becomes Plato's most brilliant student, but even then, he's pushing back. He respects his teacher. He doesn't worship him. Plato believes you need to understand the abstract form of the good to be virtuous. Aristotle thinks that's backwards. You need to look at actual people living actual lives. You need to examine what virtuous people do, not theorize about what virtue might be in some invisible dimension. 347 BCE. Plato dies. The academy passes to his nephew Speusippus, not to Aristotle. This stings. Aristotle leaves Athens. He spends the next 12 years traveling. He goes to Assos in Asia Minor. He studies marine biology on the island of Lesbos. He marries Pythias, the niece of his friend Hermias. They have a daughter together. Then Philip II of Macedon summons him. The king wants Aristotle to tutor his son. That son is Alexander, future conqueror, future legend. For 2 or 3 years, Aristotle teaches the young prince. We don't know exactly what lessons passed between them, but Alexander goes on to conquer most of the known world. And he sends plant and animal specimens back to his former teacher. Aristotle uses these to establish the first zoo and botanical garden in recorded history. 335 BCE. Alexander's conquest of Athens is complete. Aristotle returns to the city. He's 49 years old. He's a foreigner. In Greek legal terms, a metic. He cannot own property in Athens, so he rents a building. It's located in a public exercise area dedicated to Apollo Lykios. This becomes the Lyceum, Aristotle's own school, a direct rival to Plato's academy. The building has a covered walkway, a peripatos. Students walk while they discuss philosophy. This is where the term peripatetic comes from, the walking philosophers. For the next 12 years, Aristotle lectures here. He researches, he writes. His wife Pythias dies, and he finds companionship with Herpillus of Stagira. They have a son. Aristotle names him Nicomachus, after his father. This matters because the most important ethical treatise in Western history will carry that name, the Nicomachean Ethics. 10 books. Over 250 pages in modern translation. The foundation of virtue ethics for 2 millennia. Here's what makes Aristotle's approach so different. He doesn't start with rules. He doesn't start with divine commands. He asks a simple question: what is the purpose of human life? In Greek, he's looking for the telos, the end goal, the function. Everything has a function, he argues. The function of a knife is to cut. A good knife cuts well. The function of an eye is to see. A good eye sees clearly. So what is the function of a human being? What do humans do that nothing else does? Aristotle's answer is reason. Logos. We are the rational animal. We alone can deliberate. We alone can reflect on our choices. We alone can ask whether our actions align with our values. Therefore, the good life for humans must involve reasoning well, living in accordance with reason. This is the foundation. Everything else builds from here. But Aristotle doesn't stop at reason. He introduces eudaimonia. This word gets mistranslated as happiness all the time. That's a mistake. Happiness in English sounds like a feeling, a mood, something that comes and goes. Eudaimonia is different. It means flourishing. It means well-being in the deepest sense. It means living your entire life excellently. Not one good day, not one moment of pleasure, a complete life. Lived well. Aristotle says one swallow doesn't make a summer. One good deed doesn't make you virtuous. Eudaimonia requires consistency. It requires a lifetime of excellent activity. And here's the crucial insight. Eudaimonia is not something you pursue. It's not a target you aim at and hit. It's an activity. It's something you do. You don't have happiness. You perform happiness every day through your actions, through your choices, through the way you engage with the world. Now we get to virtue itself. The Greek word is areta. It means excellence, not just moral goodness in our modern sense, excellence in function. A virtuous knife has the excellence that lets it cut well. A virtuous person has the excellences that let them live well. Aristotle divides these excellences into 2 categories: intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues come from teaching. You learn them through instruction. They include theoretical wisdom, which the Greeks called sophia, scientific knowledge, episteme, understanding, nous, and practical wisdom, phronesis. We'll come back to phronesis. It's the keystone of the entire system. Moral virtues are different. You don't learn them in a classroom. You develop them through practice, through habituation. The Greek word for habit is ethos. That's where we get the word ethics. Your character, your ethos, comes from your habits. Your ethos, similar words, deep connection. You become what you repeatedly do. This is where Aristotle's psychological genius shows itself. He doesn't say humans are born virtuous. He doesn't say we're born vicious either. We're born with the capacity for virtue. We have the potential. But potential means nothing without actualization. You have the potential to play the guitar. That doesn't make you a guitarist. You have to practice. Hours and hours, day after day, year after year. Eventually, something shifts. The skill becomes second nature. You don't have to think about finger placement anymore. Your hands know what to do. Virtue works the same way. You want to be courageous? Practice courageous acts. You want to be generous? Practice generous acts. At first, it feels forced, uncomfortable. You're pretending, but keep doing it. Keep choosing the right action in the right situation. Eventually, it becomes who you are. The action flows from your character, not from effort, not from calculation, from the stable disposition you've built through years of practice. The Greek word for this stable disposition is hexis. This is massively important. Modern translators often render it as habit. That's misleading. Habit in English suggests something automatic, mindless. You brush your teeth out of habit, no thought required. Hexis is the opposite. It's an active condition, something you have to hold yourself in. Like an athlete maintaining perfect form, it requires attention, engagement, choice. A hexis is a disposition you possess, but you possess it actively. You maintain it through continuous effort. Joe Sachs translates it as active condition. That captures the meaning better. Virtue isn't autopilot. It's a state of readiness, a way of being that you sustain through deliberate action. Now comes the famous doctrine of the mean. This gets misunderstood constantly. People think Aristotle is saying be moderate in everything. Find the middle ground. Compromise. That's not it. The mean is not arithmetic. It's not halfway between 2 numbers. It's relative to the person and the situation. Aristotle gives the example of food. 10 pounds of food might be too much for one athlete and too little for another. The right amount depends on who you are and what you need. Same with virtue. Every virtue sits between 2 vices, one of excess, one of deficiency. Courage sits between cowardice and recklessness. The coward feels too much fear. The reckless person feels too little. The courageous person feels the right amount of fear at the right time in the right situation for the right reasons. That last part matters. The right amount isn't fixed. It changes based on circumstances. Sometimes great anger is appropriate. Sometimes even a little anger is too much. Take generosity. The excessive form is prodigality, wasteful spending, giving away everything without thought. The deficient form is stinginess, hoarding, refusing to share. The virtuous mean is liberality, giving the right amount to the right people at the right time. Or consider temperance. Too much indulgence in physical pleasures leads to licentiousness. Too little leads to insensibility. Though Aristotle admits he's never actually met anyone truly insensible to pleasure, the deficiency is rare, the excess is common, and that's human nature. We tend toward certain extremes more than others, so the virtuous person adjusts accordingly. If you know you're prone to anger, aim for patience. If you know you're prone to fear, aim for boldness. The target shifts based on your tendencies. Aristotle lists numerous virtues this way: courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, magnanimity, proper ambition, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness, wit, and justice, which he treats separately because of its complexity. Each one is a mean between two vices. Each one requires judgment, each one requires practice. And here's what's brilliant. Aristotle acknowledges that hitting the mean is hard, really hard. He quotes Homer, "Steer the ship away from the whirlpool," even if it means sailing closer to the monster. In other words, if you can't hit the exact right point, at least avoid the worst extreme. If generosity is hard for you, at least don't be miserly. If courage is difficult, at least don't be reckless. The mean is an ideal, something to aim for, not something you hit perfectly every time. Now we come to phronesis. Practical wisdom. This is the master virtue, the conductor of the whole orchestra. Without phronesis, you can't exercise any other virtue properly. Here's why. Knowing that courage is a virtue doesn't tell you what to do in a specific situation. You're walking down the street, you see someone being harassed. Do you intervene? That might be courage, or it might be recklessness that gets you killed. The situation matters. The context matters. You need to read the circumstances, assess the risks, consider the consequences. This requires practical wisdom, the ability to perceive particulars, to see what the specific moment demands. Aristotle distinguishes phronesis from other kinds of wisdom. Theoretical wisdom, Sophia, deals with unchanging truths. Mathematics, metaphysics, things that are always true. Practical wisdom deals with particulars, things that could be otherwise. Human affairs, situations that require judgment. You can't learn phronesis from a textbook. It requires experience. Aristotle says young people might be mathematical geniuses, but they can't have practical wisdom. They haven't lived long enough. They haven't faced enough situations. They haven't learned from enough mistakes. Phronesis comes from years of paying attention, years of trial and error, years of watching how actions play out. The practically wise person has what Aristotle calls the eye of the soul. They perceive the beautiful in human action. They see what the situation demands and respond accordingly, not through calculation, not through applying rules, through perception, through a kind of ethical sight that reveals what matters. The person with phronesis deliberates well. They figure out the best means to the ends that virtue makes right. Virtue makes the goal correct. Phronesis finds the path to that goal. They work together. You can't have one without the other. This connects to another crucial concept. Aristotle's treatment of acrasia, weakness of will, incontinence, the experience of knowing what's right and doing the opposite anyway. Socrates denied this was possible. He thought no one willingly chooses evil. If you truly knew the good, you'd do it. End of story. Aristotle disagrees. He looks at common experience. People know they shouldn't overeat. They overeat anyway. People know they shouldn't lose their temper. They explode anyway. This is real. This happens. So how does it work? Aristotle proposes that the acratic person has knowledge in one sense, but not another. They know the universal principle. Overeating is bad for health, but in the moment of temptation, they fail to activate that knowledge. Their perception gets overwhelmed by appetite. They don't fully grasp the particular premise. The sweet pastry is an instance of unhealthy food. Their practical syllogism breaks down. They have the major premise. They lose sight of the minor premise. And passion drives them to act before reason can intervene. It's not that they don't know. It's that they don't know in the right way at the right moment. Their knowledge is like someone asleep or drunk. They possess it, but can't use it. This is psychologically sophisticated. Modern research on self-control confirms similar patterns. People in the heat of temptation experience what psychologists call hyperbolic discounting. The immediate reward looms larger than the distant cost. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning, loses the battle to more primitive brain regions, demanding immediate gratification. Aristotle didn't have brain scans, but he understood the phenomenon. He distinguished two types of akrasia, weakness, where you deliberate but eventually give in, and impetuosity, where passion moves you to act before you even deliberate. Both involve a failure of self-control. Neither is true vice. The vicious person embraces wrong action. The acratic person knows better but fails to follow through. There's hope for the acratic. They can rebuild their character. The vicious are further gone. The solution to akrasia? The same as everything else in Aristotelian ethics. Habituation. Practice. You build your character to the point where right action flows naturally. The truly virtuous person doesn't struggle with temptation. They've trained their desires to align with their reason. They want the right things. They take pleasure in virtuous action. This is the final state. Not white-knuckling through ethical dilemmas, but genuinely enjoying the good life because you've become the kind of person who recognizes and loves what's beautiful in human action. If you're finding this useful, subscribe and let us know in the comments what city you're listening from. This script draws from Jessica Moss's peer-reviewed work on Aristotle published through New York University's Philosophy Department, and from the research of Howard Kurzer at Texas Tech University, whose 2012 book on Aristotelian virtues dissects these concepts with modern scholarly rigor. Back to the story. Books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics tackle friendship. This occupies 20% of the entire treatise. Modern ethical theories barely mention friendship. Aristotle gives it enormous weight. Why? Because he understands that humans are social animals. We don't flourish in isolation. We need others, not just for survival, for eudaimonia itself. A friendless life is incomplete, no matter how individually virtuous you might be. Aristotle identifies three types of friendship. Friendship of utility, friendship of pleasure, friendship of virtue. Most relationships fall into the first two categories. Utility friendships exist because both parties get something useful from the connection. Business partnerships. Professional networks. You're friendly with your accountant because they do your taxes. The relationship ends when the utility ends. Nothing wrong with these friendships. They serve a purpose, but they're shallow and transient. Pleasure friendships are similar. You're friends because you enjoy each other's company. You make each other laugh. You share hobbies. Young people especially form these bonds. Romance often starts here. Mutual attraction, shared pleasures. But these friendships fade when the pleasure fades. Interests change. People grow apart. What was exciting becomes boring. The foundation crumbles. The third type is different. Friendship of virtue. Complete friendship. Perfect friendship. This is rare. It exists between people who are alike in virtue. They love each other for who they are, not for what they provide. They wish good things for each other for the other's sake, not instrumentally, not because it benefits them, but because they genuinely care about their friend's well-being. These friendships take time to develop. You can't rush them. They require getting to know someone deeply, understanding their character, trusting them completely. Once formed, they're stable. Because virtue is stable, your character doesn't change overnight. So friendships based on character endure. Aristotle makes a striking claim. Friends are second selves. In your friend, you see yourself reflected. Not literally, but you recognize the same values, the same commitments, the same understanding of the good life. This creates something profound, a mirror for self-knowledge. Through observing your virtuous friend, you understand yourself better, you see your own excellence reflected in another, and you both inspire each other to greater virtue. The friendship itself becomes a space for flourishing, a context in which you can practice and perfect your character. This connects to politics in Aristotle's framework. The city-state, the polis, exists for more than protection and commerce. It exists for the good life, for eudaimonia. Citizens should cooperate not because laws compel them, but because they share a common understanding of human flourishing. They're like friends writ large, working together toward shared goods. The best political community is one where citizens feel genuine care for each other's well-being, where laws support virtue, where institutions help people become their best selves. Politics and ethics aren't separate disciplines for Aristotle. They're deeply intertwined. Individual virtue contributes to communal flourishing. Communal structures support individual development. Now we fast forward. Aristotle runs the Lyceum for 12 years. Then Alexander the Great dies in 323 BCE. Athens turns against Macedonia. Anti-Macedonian sentiment rises. Aristotle feels the threat. He remembers what Athens did to Socrates, tried and executed on charges of impiety. Aristotle is charged with the same crime. He refuses to let Athens sin twice against philosophy. He flees to Chalcis on the island of Euboea. His mother's family has property there. He lives one more year, dies in 322 BCE of a digestive ailment. He's 62 years old. In his will, he asks to be buried next to his first wife, Pythias. He leaves his works to Theophrastus, who succeeds him as head of the Lyceum. Those works undergo a strange journey. For centuries, many are lost or hidden. They resurface in the 1st century BCE when Andronicus of Rhodes edits and organizes them. The Nicomachean Ethics takes shape as we know it today. From there, the influence explodes. Islamic scholars in the 9th century translate Aristotle into Arabic, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina. Known in the West as Avicenna, they call Aristotle the first teacher. They integrate his logic with Islamic theology. They wrestle with reconciling his ethics with Quranic teachings. Ibn Rushd, called Averroes, writes extensive commentaries. He defends Aristotle's rationalism. His work travels across North Africa and into Spain, 12th century Christian Europe. The Aristotelian texts start arriving in Latin translation, through Arab scholars, through Greek originals. Gerard of Cremona, William of Morbecca, James of Venice, they translate furiously. The texts hit the medieval universities like an intellectual earthquake. Suddenly, there's this comprehensive philosophical system addressing everything from biology to metaphysics to ethics. Thomas Aquinas sees the opportunity. He synthesizes Aristotle with Christian theology. His Summa Theologica is massive, hundreds of thousands of words, Aristotelian concepts throughout, the distinction between essence and existence, the role of reason in understanding God's creation, the virtue ethics framework adapted for Christian morality. Aquinas writes commentaries specifically on the Nicomachean Ethics. He takes Aristotle's virtues and integrates them with faith, hope, and charity. He develops natural law theory from Aristotelian foundations. The idea that ethical truths are built into nature? That reason can discover God's moral law by observing the world. This becomes Catholic doctrine. Aristotle, a pagan philosopher who died 3 centuries before Christ, shapes Christian theology for the next 800 years. Dante calls him the master of those who know. Thomas Aquinas refers to him simply as the philosopher. No further identification needed. Everyone knows who you mean. Protestant universities continue teaching Aristotelian ethics into the 17th century. Over 50 Protestant commentaries on the Nicomachean Ethics appear before 1682. Then the Enlightenment shifts focus. Kant emphasizes duty. Bentham emphasizes consequences. Utilitarianism, deontology. These dominate modern moral philosophy. Aristotle recedes. Virtue ethics becomes a footnote. For almost 3 centuries, Western philosophy treats ethics as rule-following or outcome-maximizing. Character gets sidelined. Then, 1958, Elizabeth Anscombe publishes Modern Moral Philosophy, a short essay, a philosophical hand grenade. She argues that modern ethics is incoherent. It uses concepts like moral ought and obligation without their theological foundation. These ideas make sense in a divine command framework. God commands, you obey. But secular philosophy stripped out God and kept the vocabulary. Nonsense. Says Anscombe, we need to return to virtue, to Aristotle, to concepts like character and flourishing that don't depend on divine lawgivers. Alasdair MacIntyre picks up the thread after Virtue appears in 1981. He diagnoses modern morality as fragmented. We have bits and pieces of older systems. We've lost the coherent framework. We argue endlessly about ethics because we're speaking different languages. We've rejected Aristotelian teleology without replacing it with anything meaningful. MacIntyre proposes returning to virtue ethics. Not exactly as Aristotle taught it, but in that spirit, understanding that morality requires community, requires shared practices, requires a conception of human purpose. The virtue ethics revival explodes from there. Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, Martha Nussbaum. They develop neo-Aristotelian frameworks. They grapple with updating ancient concepts for modern life. They defend eudaimonia against charges of elitism. They argue that flourishing is empirical, not mystical. Claims about human well-being connect to actual facts about human psychology and biology. We're social creatures. We need friendships. We need meaningful work. We need communities. These aren't arbitrary preferences. They're features of our nature, and virtue ethics builds on that nature. Modern neuroscience enters the conversation. Researchers at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues conduct studies on phronesis. They develop the Aristotelian phronesis model. 4 functions: constitutive, perceiving what the situation demands; blueprint, understanding how different virtues apply; integrative, balancing competing virtues when they conflict; regulatory, managing emotions so they support rather than undermine virtue; They test this model empirically. They publish results in PLOS 1 in 2025. They find that practical wisdom really does function the way Aristotle described. It's a meta-virtue. It orchestrates the others. Brain imaging studies support the developmental model too. Early habituation actually shapes neural pathways. When children practice virtuous behaviors, their brains literally rewire. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and impulse control, strengthens its connections. Emotional regulation improves. The reward system begins to find satisfaction in prosocial behavior. This isn't mysticism, it's measurable. Habits create neurological tracks. The more you use them, the stronger they become. Eventually, virtuous action requires less effort because the neural architecture supports it. You've built a brain that naturally tends toward excellence. The somatic marker hypothesis from Antonio Damasio aligns with Aristotle too. Emotions aren't separate from reason. They inform it. They mark experiences as good or bad. They guide future decision-making. When you feel that gut sense that something is wrong, that's your emotional system flagging a problem. Aristotle understood this integration. Virtue requires appropriate emotional responses, not just right actions, right feelings at the right times. Your emotions need training alongside your reason. They need to align. When they do, you achieve the harmony that characterizes the fully virtuous person. Here's what makes this all genius. Aristotle built a system that's simultaneously ancient and cutting edge. He grounded morality in human nature, not in abstract rules, not in divine commands, in what we actually are. Rational social animals who flourish through excellent activity performed over a complete life. He recognized that becoming good takes work. It's not innate, it's not automatic. It's a skill you develop through practice. He understood that context matters. The mean shifts based on circumstances. Phronesis perceives those shifts and responds accordingly. He acknowledged weakness of will as a real phenomenon requiring explanation. He mapped friendship as essential to flourishing, not optional. He connected individual virtue to communal well-being, ethics and politics as one continuous inquiry. 2,400 years after his death, we're still excavating his insights. The Lyceum itself was only discovered archaeologically in 1996, during construction in Athens. They found the remnants, the place where Aristotle walked and taught, where he wrote the ethics we still study, where he shaped the intellectual tradition that would influence Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and secular philosophy for millennia. The site is open to visitors today. Admission is €6. You can stand where he stood, you can walk where his students walked. The physical space exists even if the ideas have traveled further than he ever could have imagined. In his final year, exiled from Athens, separated from his school, facing charges that would sound familiar to anyone who knew Socrates, fate, Aristotle left behind a body of work that defies summary. 150 treatises, most lost. What survives still fills volumes. And the Nicomachean Ethics stands at the center of his practical philosophy. 10 books laying out how to live well, how to become the person capable of flourishing, how to build character through habit, how to perceive particulars through practical wisdom, how to find the mean between extremes, how to cultivate friendships that enrich your life, how to contribute to a community worth belonging to. The genius wasn't in creating abstract theory. It was in observing humans as they actually are and building ethics from that foundation. We're not purely rational beings. We have appetites, emotions, desires that pull against our better judgment. Aristotle accounts for all of it. We're not isolated individuals. We live in communities. We need others. Aristotle builds that into the system. We don't become good overnight. Character development takes time, a lifetime. Aristotle insists on this. We face situations that demand judgment, not rule following. Aristotle provides phronesis as the answer. Modern positive psychology draws from these wells. Martin Seligman's work on flourishing, character strengths research. The idea that well-being involves more than pleasure. It involves meaning, engagement, accomplishment, positive relationships. All of this echoes Aristotle. Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence work begins with a quote from the Nicomachean Ethics. The challenge of getting angry at the right person, at the right time, to the right degree, for the right purpose. That's Aristotle's mean, that's emotional virtue. That's what we're still trying to figure out. Here's the final piece, the late reveal that reframes everything. In 2025, researchers published findings in PLOS 1, establishing the neo-Aristotelian phronesis model empirically. They identified 10 distinct components of practical wisdom through factor analysis, not just the 4 they expected. 10 interrelated elements: moral deliberation, aspired moral identity, emotion regulation, seeing the best in situations, blueprinting, and more. These components connect in network fashion, Change one and you affect the others. Strengthen moral deliberation and emotion regulation improves. Build aspired moral identity and moral perception sharpens. This isn't philosophy anymore. It's measurement. It's psychometrics. It's empirical science validating insights from 384 BCE. The short phronesis, measure they developed, takes 15 to 20 minutes to administer. Nationally representative samples from the UK and US, demographically matched to census data, test-retest reliability over 2 months, predictive validity for flourishing, moral disengagement, and moral personality factors. Average increase in predictive power of 13.7%, beyond what moral foundations alone explain. Aristotle is still teaching, still providing frameworks that hold up under modern scrutiny, still pointing toward truths about human nature that resist the fashions of any single era. His virtue ethics revival continues, his influence on neuroscience grows, his insights about character, habit, practical wisdom, and flourishing remain relevant not because they're ancient, but because they're accurate. The man from Stagira, who studied under Plato and taught Alexander the Great, understood something fundamental. Being good is not about following rules or calculating outcomes. It's about becoming. Becoming the kind of person whose character naturally produces excellent action, whose emotions align with reason, whose practical wisdom perceives what each unique situation demands, whose friendships are grounded in shared virtue, whose flourishing contributes to community well-being. Consider what this means practically. Take courage again. The modern approach says, be brave. That's the rule. Follow it? Aristotle says, no. Courage is the mean between cowardice and rashness regarding fear and confidence. The cowardly person fears everything. The rash person fears nothing. The courageous person fears the right things at the right time. Death in battle is fearful. A courageous soldier fears it, but he faces it anyway because the cause is worth the fear. The key isn't eliminating fear. It's having appropriate fear matched with appropriate confidence. And this changes based on context. What counts as courage for a trained soldier differs from what counts as courage for a civilian. The mean is relative to the person and the situation. Always. Aristotle also examines what he calls the nameless virtues. Some means exist between extremes, but the Greeks never gave them proper names. The mean regarding anger, for example, we have names for the excess, hot-tempered, irascible, and for the deficiency, apathetic, unfeeling. But the mean itself, good-tempered, doesn't quite capture it. The person who gets angry at the right things for the right reasons in the right way for the right duration, that's the virtue. But the language doesn't have a clean word for it. Aristotle acknowledges this gap. The framework matters more than perfect terminology. He spends considerable time on magnanimity, the virtue of great-souled people. This is controversial today. Magnanimity involves having an accurate sense of your own worth and demanding the honor you deserve. The magnanimous person knows they're excellent and acts accordingly. They don't grovel. They don't boast either. They simply know their value and conduct themselves with appropriate dignity. The excess is vanity, claiming more than you deserve. The deficiency is pusillanimity, small-souled, thinking less of yourself than you should. Missing opportunities because you don't believe you're capable. The magnanimous person hits the mean. They know what they're worth, not more, not less, and they expect to be treated accordingly. Modern readers often find this uncomfortable. It sounds like arrogance. But Aristotle is being precise. He's not advocating false humility. He's not advocating false pride. He's advocating accurate self-assessment. If you've genuinely developed excellence, acknowledge it. If you haven't, work on it. The problem isn't knowing your worth. The problem is miscalculating it. Getting it wrong in either direction damages both you and your community. Then there's truthfulness, the virtue regarding self-presentation in everyday life. The excess is boastfulness, claiming accomplishments you don't have, exaggerating your abilities. The deficiency is false modesty, understating what you've done, denying your achievements. The truthful person presents themselves accurately. They don't inflate. They don't deflate. They tell the truth about themselves, because that's what virtuous character demands. Honesty isn't just about not lying to others, it's about accurately representing who you are. Wit also gets treatment. The virtue regarding humor and entertainment. The excess is buffoonery, making jokes constantly, saying anything for a laugh, sacrificing appropriateness for amusement. The deficiency is boorishness, never joking, taking everything seriously, missing the value of lightheartedness. The witty person knows when humor serves the situation. They make people laugh, but not at inappropriate times. They bring levity without sacrificing dignity. They understand that social life requires moments of joy and that humor, deployed well, strengthens relationships and relieves tension. What's remarkable is how these specific virtues connect back to the larger framework. Each one requires phronesis to execute. Each one develops through habituation. Each one contributes to eudaimonia. Each one exists in relation to others and to community. Aristotle isn't giving you a rulebook. He's painting a portrait of excellent human character in all its complexity. The virtuous person navigates social situations with grace, handles money with wisdom, faces danger with appropriate courage, pursues honor without vanity, tells the truth about themselves, brings joy to others through well-timed humor. All of this requires judgment. All of this requires practice. All of this requires a life dedicated to becoming rather than merely doing. The situationist critique emerged in the 20th century as a challenge to virtue ethics. Social psychologists like Walter Mischel and Stanley Milgram ran experiments suggesting that situations determine behavior more than character does. The Milgram obedience experiments showed ordinary people administering what they believed were painful shocks because an authority figure told them to. The Stanford prison experiment showed college students becoming abusive guards when placed in that role. Critics argued that Aristotelian virtue ethics was psychologically naive. People don't have stable characters. They respond to environmental pressures. Virtue ethicists have pushed back. Christian Miller at Wake Forest University argues that character is real, but not as simple as Aristotle suggested. Most people have what he calls mixed traits, neither fully virtuous nor fully vicious. Situational factors do matter, but so does character. The two interact. A person with some degree of courage might resist in one situation, but comply in another, depending on the pressures involved. This doesn't disprove virtue. It clarifies that developing robust virtue is genuinely difficult, which Aristotle already said. He never claimed everyone becomes virtuous easily. He claimed the opposite. Excellence requires years of habituation under proper guidance. Most people never fully achieve it. The integration with psychology continues developing. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset aligns surprisingly well with Aristotelian ethics. The fixed mindset says your abilities are set. You're either smart or you're not. The growth mindset says abilities develop through effort. You can get smarter through work. This parallels exactly what Aristotle says about virtue. You're not born virtuous or vicious. You develop character through practice. The capacity is there. The actualization requires effort. Believing you can become more courageous or more generous isn't wishful thinking. It's recognizing how human psychology actually functions. Angela Duckworth's work on grit connects too. Grit is passion and perseverance for long-term goals, sticking with things even when they're hard. This sounds like Aristotelian habituation. Building virtuous character requires sustained effort over time. One day of generous acts doesn't make you generous. Years of generous acts might. Grit is what keeps you practicing when the practice is difficult. It's the psychological trait that enables the habituation Aristotle describes. The contemplative life also deserves mention. At the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that the highest form of eudaimonia involves theoretical contemplation, engaging in pure intellectual activity, philosophy, science, understanding eternal truths. He sees this as the most divine human activity. The gods contemplate eternally. When humans contemplate, we participate in something godlike. This creates tension in his system. If contemplation is highest, what about the practical virtues? What about courage and generosity and justice? Scholars debate this. Some say Aristotle has two competing visions of the good life. Others say contemplation requires the practical virtues as prerequisites. You can't philosophize well if your character is disordered. You need ethical virtue to free your mind for higher intellectual activity. The practical implications extend into professional ethics today. Doctors increasingly discuss medical virtue. What character traits should physicians have? Technical competence isn't enough. You need compassion. Integrity. Practical wisdom to navigate difficult cases. Engineers discuss similar questions. What virtues does engineering practice require? Accuracy. Safety consciousness. Concern for public welfare. Business ethicists talk about commercial virtue. Can you be a virtuous business person? What would that look like? Aristotle's framework provides vocabulary for these conversations. The virtues aren't one size fits all. They're shaped by practices and contexts, but the fundamental structure remains. Character matters. Habituation builds character. Practical wisdom guides action. Military ethics draws heavily from virtues theory. What makes a good soldier? Courage, obviously, but also justice, following ethical rules of engagement. Temperance, not giving in to anger or cruelty. Practical wisdom, knowing when to fight and when to hold back. The just war tradition integrates Aristotelian ethics with military considerations. A just war requires right intention. That's a character trait, not just following orders. Having the right motivation, fighting for justice rather than revenge. Environmental ethics has also picked up virtue language. What character traits should we develop regarding nature? Respect for wilderness, humility before natural systems, moderation in resource consumption, concern for future generations. These aren't rules exactly, they're dispositions, ways of being in relationship with the natural world. Aristotelian virtue ethics provides a framework for thinking about environmental character in ways that rule-based ethics struggle to capture. All of this circles back to the core insight. Ethics is about who you become, not just what you do in isolated moments. Your character is the stable pattern of your choices, your habits, your emotional responses, your ways of perceiving situations. Aristotle built a comprehensive account of this. He showed how virtue develops through practice, how practical wisdom guides virtuous action, how happiness flows from excellent activity across a complete life, how friendship enriches flourishing, how individuals and communities depend on each other for ethical development. The Lyceum site in Athens now sits near the Museum of Modern Art. Ancient philosophy adjacent to contemporary culture. The contrast is fitting. Aristotle's insights prove their worth precisely because they endure across radically different historical contexts. His virtue ethics wasn't just for ancient Greeks and city-states. The framework adapts. It applies wherever humans live in communities and face ethical challenges, which is everywhere, always. That's not Sunday school morality. That's a sophisticated system for human excellence built on observation, reason, and psychological insight that 2,400 years of human history has failed to supersede. And that is why the way Aristotle understood virtue was much more genius than you imagine.